Thank you, TJ. Uh, and thank you for all of you for coming. So let's get started and talk about USA number one, America's number one. We've all grown up with it. We've all heard that, oh, we have the best schools, we have the best education system, we have the best medical facilities, we have the best roads. And 40 or 50 years ago, even 60 years ago, a lot of that was true. Things have changed drastically over the years, and we're going to talk a little bit about what has changed and where our position actually is in the United States today. And let's talk about some easy ones first in terms where we are absolutely number one. The US dollar. The US dollar is actually the world's currency. It's estimated that 64% of countries around the world use the US dollar as a reserve currency. And if you've traveled around the world and you know you're short of whatever the local currency happens to be, and you ask them, will you take dollars? Universally, it's accepted. Because we have a lot of dollars, we also have more billionaires than anywhere else in the world. Right now, there are a total of 565 billionaires residing in the United States, including the home of Jeff Bezos, who is classified as the richest man in the world. We dominate in the area of scientific research, medical research, and drug development. We are clearly the world's leader in all of those all of those characteristics. Because we do a lot of medical work, we also do a lot of plastic surgery. We are the number one, and I suspect the desert here is probably a prime example of it. We are the capital. We're the world's capital for plastic surgery. Last year, a total of 4.5 million treatments were administered in the United States, and it is somewhere around an $18 billion industry. We talked about education. MIT was recently named the world's best university. In fact, if you take the world's top 5 universities, universities in America occupy 3 spots on that list. France has 1,000 registered cheeses, but we produce more than anybody else. We are the largest cheese producer in the world. It's a $17 billion business. Excuse me for a second. Land of the automobile is also the land of the roads. We have more roads, bridges, and highways than any place else in the world. We have 4 million miles of roads in the U.S. We also lead in dogs and cats, or cats and dogs, I should say, probably is more appropriate. 7 million dogs, 74 million cats, and not too surprisingly, we're indulgent pet owners. We spend more than any other country on our pets, and more on a per capita basis as well. We're a charitable country. We lead the world in charitable contributions. Last year, the United States donated in excess of $400 billion to charitable organizations, an increase of almost 5% from the previous year. Much like medical research, we lead in technology. The U.S. has given the planet the microchip, the personal computer, Facebook, which I'm not sure is a great gift, and more companies dominate the tech industry than any other country in the world. We lead in Nobel Prizes by far, 260 Nobel Prizes in the United States. The UK comes a very distant second with 84. America's sporting prowess is known throughout the world. We have run 8 Olympics, more than any other country, and we have generated or won a total of 2,600 Olympic medals over the years. Number one in aerospace and aviation. We lead the world in aircraft engines, parts, helicopters, and more. We also have another side of us. We're the number one leader in the world in fast food. 10 of the leading fast food companies happen to be located here in the United States. It's a $200 billion a year business. And this probably won't surprise you. We consume more fast food than any other country in the world. We like living big. The average house in the U.S. is twice the size of the house in the UK. Well, that was just a glimpse of some of the places that we excel in. What I'd like to do now is take a deeper dive into some of the key aspects of life in the U.S. We're going to look at the economy, we're going to look at social mobility, we're going to look at health, we're going to look at education. One of the things that drives all the firsts we've just talked about is the fact that we are the third largest country in the world in terms of population, after China being number one and India being number two. So some of our firsts are simply because of the mass of people we have here. More people, spending more money, therefore creating more firsts. One of the things we're going to try and do is we're going to try and break that down today and not look at us so much as a totality. We'll look at that in some charts, but more so on a per capita basis, basically by individual. Because it's somewhat unfair to compare ourselves, for example, with a population of over 330 million with, let's say, England with 55 million. So we'll break it down and take a closer look at actually where we stand. First thing I want to do is take a look at the economy. Clearly a driving force today. A lot of the charts I'm going to be showing you, I didn't realize how big the screen is, and I'm used to teaching with a screen probably a quarter of this size, are going to be a little bit like mind charts, but I'll spend some time and use the pointer to address the key issues on them. A lot of the data that I'm going to be addressing comes from an organization called the OECD, which is the Organization for Economically Developed Countries. Now, this is an organization of 36 countries, mostly Western Europe, the Pacific Rim, who are regarded as economically developed. So when we're comparing ourselves, we can't be comparing ourselves to a still developing country like Ecuador or Nigeria. So the only fair comparison is like countries. The OECD data allows us to do that. Well, this next chart probably won't surprise you. We are clearly the number one economy in the world. In terms of our nominal GDP, gross domestic product, that is how much we produce every day. We are clearly in a number one position with our, let's go back, with our gross domestic product currently at about $220 trillion. Our next closest competitor is China, but one of the key things you have to look at, and I'll be looking at it in the next chart, is China's growth. We're growing at a rate, projected this rate this year, we're going to grow at about 1.7 to somewhere around 2%. China's been growing at about the 6% rate. As a result of that growth rate, in about somewhere in the next 3 to 5 years, this is China's growth chart, this is the US's growth chart. They will surpass us, and they will become the largest economy in the world. What we will not lose, however, is our per capita position. While China will have a larger economy than we are, because of the number of people that economy has to serve, what will happen is right now our GDP per capita or per individual is roughly around $60,000. China, even with its growth, is only going to be somewhere around $11,000 or $12,000. So what that does is it continues to make us quote, we used to think the richest country in the world. We're not actually quite there. Because again, if we want to look at where we stand versus other economically developed countries, what you can see is Luxembourg is by far the richest country in the world. Every individual there accounts for almost $112,000 worth of their GDP. Norway, Qatar, Switzerland, Austria, Denmark, Sweden, San Marino, Singapore, and here we are, the United States. We're actually in the 10th position. The rest of the world averages at about $10,000, which is pretty close to where China is. Now we begin to see in this next chart some of the anomalies that is the United States. This is a Gini coefficient, which measures income distribution and poverty level, an internationally accepted term. We have, for our economy, one of the largest levels of poverty in the economically developed world. By our federal standards, 14% of our population lives in poverty. We're second only to Mexico. That's a pretty sobering statistic. One of the things that's also consistent about the United States is we don't like to pay taxes. We constantly hear and complain about our tax rates in the United States, yet we are second lowest of virtually all the economically developed countries. And this is going to impact a lot of services that we have and a lot of emphasis that is put on the consumer and consumer spending. The OECD average, that is the 36 countries that are economically developed, pay an average of about 37%. We are fully a third off that. So we're 30% below our tax rate. And you've heard the expression, the consumer is king, and you may never have completely understood that. This is why. Our economy is driven 70% by consumer spending versus the average of the other economically developed countries is 54%. So what happens is a lot of things that government takes care of in other countries fall to the responsibility of us as citizens. We have essentially made a grand bargain with the federal government saying, I don't want to pay taxes, give me the money, and I will take care of myself. Now, this is part of the self-sufficiency, that has been part of the American character for years, but it results in a disproportionate allocation of our resources. And that 70%, by the way, is not just going to the mall or clicking buy on Amazon. It's also affected in essential services that we have to pay for. Medical, for example, higher education, some elements of transportation, which are federal government responsibilities in other countries. As a result of a low tax base and relatively modest income for the federal government, we also run the highest deficits of any of the economically developed countries. Deficits that, very honestly, we can't sustain on a long-term basis. The deficit this year is going to be over $1 trillion. The projection by the Office of the Budget is it will be in excess of $1 trillion for the next 5 years. That's as far out as the projections go. As a result of that, our national debt keeps increasing at geometric rates every year. And the result is that currently our debt level is 110% of our GDP, meaning literally we have debts more than we could pay off if we put all of our GDP against it in year. That is one of the highest ratios of debt to gross domestic product in the industrialized world. Let's move on to how we do spend our money. One of the biggest expenditures we have in the United States is military and defense. I'll give you an example. We spend in the neighborhood of $6.5 billion a year, more than the next 7 countries combined. China, which has a military force almost twice the size of ours, gets by with less than half of the spending. The result of that is, if we took at all the spending in the world, we spend 43% of what the world spends on military and military alone. Now, one of the issues that creates is it has a huge impact on our GDP. We spend 3.4% of our GDP on the military. OECD countries spend an average of about 1.6. Both the Obama and the Trump administration have been pushing NATO members, you may have heard about it, to get it up to 2%, which is what they have pledged when they're part of NATO. One of the things that happens with OECD countries with a 1.6% and us at a 3.4% is that assumes a bigger chunk of the money that is available to spend. So the fact that we're spending it on the military means that we have actually less to spend on roads, medical, infrastructure, education, etc. And to give you an idea of what the U.S. budget looks like, if we take a look at the total budget for the U.S., 70% of it is mandatory spending. That is, before the budgets are done, 70% of the dollars are gone. That's interest payments, that's Medicare, that's Social Security, that's Medicaid. The balance of the 30% that we have to spend is then divided in a wide variety of areas. And defense takes up almost half of it. So half of our discretionary spending, that is the money that we can spend on providing services for our constituents, goes. The larger the defense budget is, the smaller education, transportation, veterans, income security, health, administration, international affairs, natural resources, etc., gets diminished. Now, this is a choice we have made as a country. We want a strong military. With the strong military comes the sacrifices that we have to make in some other areas. Let's take a look at health in the United States. We are the only country among economically developed countries that has actually had a decrease in life expectancy over the last 10 years. We currently rank 54th in life expectancy in the world. Now, there are a couple of factors that are impacting that. By the way, for those of you who want to challenge me, 3 days ago it was announced that for the first time, we have actually turned it up and we have a little uptick. We went up by about 3 weeks in terms of life expectancy. Now, I know that doesn't sound like a lot, but I mean, that's how fine these things are measured. The interesting thing is that number today, which is, let's say, 78.7, puts us exactly where we were in 2010. So that's the decline we've experienced over the last few years. When we look at reasons why, one of the chief reasons is what the medical community is calling diseases of despair. And diseases of despair, in which we lead the world, not being proud of being number one, that is deaths from suicide alcohol, and opioid addiction. We are number one in the world. Here's an example. This is 52,000 people died. You can see North America, it's only 55,000. So it's all coming from the U.S. And these are areas. We're talking about Western, Central Europe, Africa, etc. These are, in fact, opioid deaths. Overdose deaths have risen dramatically since the early 2000s. In the period between 1999 and 2017, which is the last year I was able to get data on, we have had 750,000 deaths from drug overdoses in the United States. Another contributing factor in our low mortality rate is we lead the world in infant mortality. We have 6 deaths per 1,000. Comparable country average is approximately half that. That's a result of generally weak prenatal care and lack of access to medical services by the indigent population in the United States. Another area we're number one in is obesity. I talked about we have more fast food outlets than anywhere in the world, and we consume more fast food than any place else in the world. Well, this is the result. And if we go back to the 70s and 80s, you can see we were at relatively low levels. But look at the acceleration. We exceed Mexico, which is considered generally an obese country. And right now, we project that by 2030, a little less than half of the population will be defined as clinically obese. Part of the result of that is we have one of the highest rates of diabetes in the world. And you can see right now we're at about 11%. In the next 10 years, we expect that to go up by almost 50% to 15% of the population. So we have these problems in healthcare. How well do we deliver? Well, unfortunately, we don't deliver very well. This is an overall ranking of the quality of healthcare. Basically, quality of care, access, efficiency, equity, and other indicators like infant mortality rates. So these are the scalings. Give you a little bit more specifics on it. I went and plowed through a bunch of research. 3 organizations have done extensive studies on our overall healthcare ranking. Bloomberg, this is the data from the OECD and the World Health Organization. Interestingly, the rankings, 35th, 34th, and 37th. So, yes, we're going to get some slight differences, but you can see they're all clustering roughly around the mid-30s. So that's our overall health ranking. We have another first. We pay more for health care than anybody else in the world. We average a little over $10,000 per individual to service their health care needs here in the United States. The average of all the other countries is about half that, $5,000. Now, one of the reasons for this is virtually every other country has guaranteed 100% medical care for all of its citizens. Some of them are what are called single-payer systems. That is where the government runs the medical facilities. So if we have any Canadians here in the office, you have a single-payer system. Britain has a single-payer system. But many of the other countries don't. Many of the other countries mandate insurance and then provide insurance supplements So, it's not necessary that the government runs everything. The government, however, in all these countries mandates that everybody does have insurance. Again, when we look at impact on GDP, here's what other countries spend. Roughly about 10% of their GDP is directed towards medical care. For us, it's almost 16%. We're twice the OECD average. So again, that shrinks available money for other aspects. One of the reasons driving this high percentage in those costs, here are administrative costs in other countries. This is the administrative cost in the United States for our insurances. Okay. 3 to 4 times what any other country pays for administration. As a result, we end up with the lowest efficiency rating of any country in the world for our healthcare delivery system. So we have a system which underperforms, and we are paying a disproportionate amount for that underperformance. That's the reality of healthcare in the United States today. And give you an idea of how much more we're paying. Hip replacement, roughly $30,000 versus $17,000 in other countries. 28 versus 18, 16 versus 8 for an appendectomy, roughly 16 versus 6. So our costs are by far higher than anybody else. And with the rise of obesity and the rise of diabetes, okay, I guess that's not the chart. All right. I'll get back to that. But I mentioned earlier, we are number 1 in medical research and number 1 in drug research. And we have more drug companies headquartered in the United States than anywhere else in the world. And as a result of that, we end up paying more for our drugs than anybody else. Lantus, which is a diabetes drug, roughly 168 in the US. This 5-country average, by the way. I didn't just want to take Europe, so I looked at Germany, France, the UK, Japan, and Canada to get a broad cross-section of what was happening across the world. So the other interesting thing, like I showed you on the ratings chart for healthcare, roughly in the mid-30s, the range around the numbers for the 5-country average was very, very small. So the 61 may be a range of 58 to 66, but there really were no outliers. Let's look at a couple of others. Crestor, which is for cholesterol, we pay $86. The other countries pay $30. Januvia, which is a diabetes drug, Advair, which is an asthma drug, we pay $155. Other countries pay $49. Genevia, which is a diabetic drug, $169 versus $47. Now let's get into some of the heavy-duty ones. Humira, which is, again, for arthritis, costs a patient here $2,500. Those other countries around $1,200. And Gleevec, which is a leukemia drug, $10,000 versus $2,500. Now, the federal government just announced that it's going to let states go to Canada to buy their drugs, because up until now it's been prohibited in order to save money, because Canadian drugs follow pretty closely this number here. If they may be off by a couple of dollars, but it's pretty much where they are. In terms of some other services, actually, I mentioned diabetes earlier. $360 a month versus India's $112, Japan, but here we see Japan, the UK, Italy, it's only $19. We rank 25th in physicians per 1,000. So if you have trouble getting in to see a doctor, you may know why. We have less of them than many other countries have. It's also sometimes tough to get into a hospital. We rank 32nd in hospital beds per 1,000 in the rest of the world. Take a break for just a minute. Let's take a look at education. This is one of those mind-numbing charts, so bear with me. This is a PISA chart. PISA stands for Program for International Student Assessment. It's conducted through the OECD every 3 years. And basically, it measures 15-year-olds' performance, roughly sophomores in high school, in 3 key areas: reading, math, and science. Overall, here we are. We rank 30th in the world. That's 30th out of 36 OECD countries. Here are some of our scores from the 15 test. We ranked 22nd in reading, 24th in science, and 36th in math. Isn't function of spending. In fact, this is K through 12 spending per student in the OECD. Here we are. We're second highest only to Switzerland. But what happens, interestingly, it's very much like medical. We pay a disproportionate amount for administrators versus any other countries. We also spend a disproportionate amount on facilities than any other countries. So we have more administrators and nicer classrooms. Unfortunately, we're not producing a very good result from that. And I think an example of this, I don't know how many of you remember in the late Bush II administration, the early part of the Obama administration, there was a core concept. The idea was states were going to get together and set academic standards that everybody would be volunteered to try and raise these PISA scores. A list of standards for the first year was sent out. Second year, results came in. They were disastrous. Poor performance across the board on what our educators and what industry thought we should be proficient in. So what did we do as a country? We lowered the scores so that next year we wouldn't look as bad as we did before. Now, a couple of other factors that may be impacting the scores. One of the things that educators or people who've done an analysis of this think, they think that the U.S. does not respect education as much as other countries do. And they may be true on that. One of the things, we tend to spend a little bit less time in classrooms than a lot of our peers, 180 days a year. One of the things we clearly don't do is we don't pay our teachers very much. We're in the lower half to lower third of teacher salaries. Here's Luxembourg, the richest country in the world, and they pay their teachers exceedingly well. In other countries of the world, for example, Finland, let's see if I can find Finland on here. Here it is. Finland's one of the highest. Finland only allows its best students to become teachers. Being a teacher in Finland is kind of like being a doctor in the United States. It comes with prestige and a relatively high salary. We also like our time off, at least for our kids. U.S. summer vacation runs about an average of 10 to 11 weeks. Most OECD countries, it ranges from 7 to 8 weeks. Now, we talked about basically K through 12. Let's take a look at what happens when you graduate and you want to go on to college. Here are costs for public, now this data is old, 15, 16, but it still holds true. The United States leads in costs for public education. This is education that is supported by the government in individual states. And we can see that in some countries, Italy, Portugal, Spain, we're at relatively low levels. I'm going to get into that a little bit at a little bit later date. And let's hope your kids or grandkids don't want to go to private schools, because there we're triple what any other country is in terms of fees. Now, let's take a look at Europe. This blue area here, college is free for every citizen of the country. That includes Scotland, virtually all the Scandinavian countries, Austria, the Czech Republic, etc. The green, the pale green here, is around $1,000, or those are euros. So add about 10-15% to it to convert this to euros. So we're looking at probably $1,250 to $1,400 to go to college in these places. By far the highest is England or the UK. Anybody want to go to Oxford or send their grandkids to Oxford? Tuition at Oxford this year is roughly $9,700. Tuition at Harvard is in excess of $60,000. Both are ranked as one of the top universities in the world. Let's take a look at how we work. This may surprise people. We are working more hours per week and more weeks per year than we ever have. 134 countries of the world set a maximum number of weeks that an employer can mandate that his employee works. The US has no mandate. So I, as an employer, can literally say, to work for me, you must work 365 days a year. In terms of how much we work, everybody used to hold Japan up as the status for working hours. We work 137 hours a year more than Japan does. And if we want to take a look at Europe, all these minus figures, that's how much less all of these countries work than we do. Fine, we work a lot, but we're also among the most productive workers in the world, with a 68% rating, significantly above the OECD average of 51. One of the problems that has happened in the United States in the last 20 years or so is our productivity has gone up dramatically. Historically, there was always a link between productivity and wages. Unfortunately, what's happened since the mid to late 70s, here you can see 50s, 60s, 70s, wages and productivity started going up. Our productivity went up dramatically. However, our wages stayed relatively flat in constant dollars. Another way of looking at that is, if we go back to 1964, comparatively, basically, in 1964, we were making about $20 an hour. Today, we're making about $22 an hour, counting for inflation. So in that 60-year period, we've actually increased our buying power by slightly less than 10%. So while we are working more hours, our workers are generally not getting compensated for it. But you can always go on vacation, except in the United States. These are paid holidays The dark green is paid holidays in all these various countries. You don't notice any dark green down here, because as I said earlier, we have no employer in the United States has a legal requirement to give any one of its employees a day's vacation that is paid. The only requirement we have is we have 10 national holidays. The Labor and Industrial Relations Board mandates that if you're required to work on that holiday, which an employer can require, you get paid time and a half or overtime pay for that being a public holiday. In addition to not having a lot of vacation time, now of course most companies do provide vacation because they know it's necessary in terms of a competitive advantage. But while it's provided, what's been happening over the years is we are actually taking less vacation time than we're entitled to. And when you ask people, go to the next chart. This is, again, slightly old data. It comes from 2014 rather, but it's all true. 40% of workers took no vacation days. And when surveys have been done with how come, I mean, you have a vacation day, a couple of things factored in. Guilt. If I take my vacation day, my employer may think less of me and I'm less loyal to the job. Fear of getting fired. If I'm not there, they'll realize they don't really need me for my job. Lack of funds. I can't afford to take a vacation. I'd rather work and get paid for it rather than take the vacation day. Well, we talked about workers overall. We know that in the United States, we've heard it often enough, that females get paid 77 cents on the dollar compared to their male counterparts. I'll be honest with you, that figure is a little gerrymandered, to be quite honest with you. When you control for things like occupation, one of the things is women tend to be employed more in the service economies, pink collar rather than blue collar, which tend to have lower wage bases. Women tend not to work overtime because they have families that they have to tend to, so that accounts for something. When you factor out all of those, however, job for job, education for education, hours put in versus hours put in, we essentially pay women somewhere between 12 and 15% less than the male. So while it's not 33, it's still a pretty bad situation. As a result of that, we actually rank 23rd in the best countries for female workers. And this is based on female economic empowerment, and it deals with things like equality in the workforce, salary, and advancement opportunities. One of the other disadvantages that women face in the United States is we are number one in not giving any weeks off for maternity leave. All of these other countries all mandate maternity leave for their workers. In fact, we're the only country in the economically developed world that does not legally mandate an employer to give an employee, a female employee, time off after she's had a child. One of the things that propelled people to the United States, one of the things that's been a driving force in the U.S. is the concept of the American dream. That is that no matter what status I've been born into, I have the opportunity to move myself up, to move from working class to middle class, move from lower middle class to middle class, move to lower middle class to upper middle class, to move from middle class to high class, move from any class I want. Next quote is from the head of the Ford Foundation. They just finished a study on social mobility. That is, the ability of an American today to fulfill the American dream. That the American dream as we know it, which was once the envy of the world, is no longer the envy of the world. In fact, the United States has fallen behind other industrialized nations in terms of economic mobility. If you want the American dream today, you ought to move to Canada. Our Canadians in the audience, you can take a bow. One of the reasons for that, there is a thing called a Gini coefficient, G-I-N-I. Okay, and what that measures is it measures income distribution across a country. Okay, the wider your income is dispersed, the easier it is to move up a class. The more a few people control all the money, the more difficult it is for you to move up a class. So basically, in terms of a Gini coefficient, a 1 means one individual owns all the wealth in that country. A Gini coefficient of 0 means that everybody in the country has the same amount of income. Well, where does the U.S. stand? At the low end of the scale, you have the Czech Republic, you have most of the Scandinavian countries. We keep moving. Britain is at the highest end, and all of a sudden, here we are, the United States, right alongside of Turkey, Chile, and Mexico, in terms of the ability of our social mobility in the United States. One of the prime reasons for that is that if we go back to the 80s, this is the share of wealth in the United States that the 1% had about 10.5, 11%. Currently, and this goes back to 15, currently that number is over 25%. So 1% of the United States owns 25% of the wealth of the United States. By the same token, this bottom 50% used to own about 21, 2%. You can see now it's half that. So the bottom 50% of the United States is actually shrunk in how much money that it literally has. Now, the result of this is that we end up with gross income inequality in the United States. You've probably heard time and time again that our middle class is shrinking, and this is one of the main reasons. The middle class is shrinking. It's not, unfortunately, going up to the upper class. It's shrinking because more and more people are being forced from the middle class into the working class. And we see some aspects of that in, for example, the high homeless rate in the United States, which is substantially higher than it is in almost any other country. The last thing we'll take a look at is infrastructure. By infrastructure, we mean basically the conditions of our roads, transportation, technology, etc. We rank, and this is a self-assessment, rank 25th in the country, and in the world rather, and when we begin to try and understand the dynamics behind that 25, here's one of the reasons. This is total public construction spending as a percentage of GDP. You can see how it's declined. We're literally spending less money on infrastructure than we ever have in any time in the past. Now, one of the reasons for that, I mentioned a little bit earlier, in America, we don't like to pay taxes. Infrastructure in the United States is handled by the Department of Transportation. The Department of Transportation gets all of its money from what is called the Highway Trust Fund. Now, the Highway Trust Fund, in turn, gets all of its money from gasoline taxes. So, if we talk about taxes and the fairness of taxes, I happen to think the gasoline tax is probably the fairest tax in the world. A very simple factor. The more gasoline you use, the more tax you pay. The more gasoline you use, the more you're driving on a road. So therefore, you're paying more to use those roads. It seems to me a very fair tax. In fact, One of the great anti-tax proponents in the United States, Ronald Reagan, actually raised the gasoline tax. And when he was challenged on it, he said, no, it's not a tax, it's a use fee. The more you use the roads, the more you have to pay for them. Give you an idea of where we are in gasoline or petrol taxes. This is, again, old data, but it still holds true. This is what every other country pays. We have the lowest gasoline taxes in the industrialized world. Mexico is actually a negative because they subsidize it. Now, I said all the money comes from the Highway Trust Fund. The Highway Trust Fund is essentially bankrupt. About 6 years ago, it was bankrupt. So we had to move 25, rather than raising the taxes, which in my sense would be a fairly sensible thing to do, we transferred $25 billion from the general fund into the Highway Trust Fund to maintain it. Now we have another problem lurking. Gasoline consumption is actually on the decline. While we have more cars on the road, three things are happening. One, older, less fuel-efficient cars are going to the junkyard. So every year we have a newer fleet of cars out there that has higher gas mileage ratings. And the federal government has mandated that the automobile companies are required to increase that miles per gallon over the next 5 to 8 years. So that's going to continue to happen. But there's another sticker which we have failed to address as a country. We have more and more hybrids and more electric cars on the road. And guess what? It may be a use fee, but if I've got an electric car, I'm not pumping any gas, and I'm not paying any gas taxes. And that's something we're going to have to address as we look at our changes in transportation over the years. And here's an idea of basically what's happened. This happened right around the Reagan administration. The last time we raised gasoline taxes was really in 1993. The purchasing power of that tax is down 40% than what it was. So basically, that 18 cents a gallon now buys about 10 cents worth of repairs. So that's a kind of cold-hearted look of where we stand in the United States today. But what I hope you begin to appreciate is the contradictions that are the United States. We're the largest economy in the world. We have the 10th highest per capita income in the world. Yet, we have the largest percentage of people living in poverty. We're the leaders in medical research. We develop more drugs in the United States than any place else. Yet, we rank 54th in life expectancy. We lead the world in paying for health care, yet we rank 34th in the delivery of it. We're home to the largest manufacturers of drugs in the world, yet we pay twice as much as other developed countries for the exact same drug. We have the highest percentage of our population with religious affiliations, yet we lead the world in diseases of despair, with the highest numbers of deaths due to alcohol, suicide, and drug overdoses. We have 4 of the top 10 universities, and we spend more per child than any other country, yet our 15-year-olds perform poorly on math, reading, and science versus their international peers. And additionally, we've priced college out of most working and middle-class families. We lead the world in Olympic gold medals, yet we have the highest rate of obesity in the world. We are the world's leader in miles of roads, highways, and bridges, yet we don't dedicate sufficient funds to maintain them. We are a great nation, and we will continue to be a great nation, a nation of promise and opportunity. But to fulfill that, we're going to have to start making some of the hard choices. so that we can deliver on those promises. So thank you, and we'll open it up for some questions.